Good evening and good afternoon to all of you. Since we have people joining across the, world, so I have to start by saying good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. So welcome to this webinar series on hydrodiplomacy and to today's particular lecture, which is on water security and integrated modeling studies. We have two very distinguished speakers today for this session. Before I move into today's session and I introduce you to the speakers, let me very briefly give you a background of the series of webinar for those for whom this is the first time you are attending this webinar series. So this is basically hosted by IIT Guwahati, and I am Professor Anamika Barua. I am a faculty in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences. This has been hosted by a number of partner institutions, as you can see the logos on the slide. Many of you may have already received this webinar series flyer, where you would see that there is a series of lecture which started on the 18th of September with an inception webinar, and this will continue till the 12th of November on touching upon several topics. So it's a very interdisciplinary sort of hydrodiplomacy webinar that we are organizing. And to our knowledge, this is the first of its kind organized by an academic institution, particularly in South Asia. Again, before I move into today's session, briefly to let you know just to set the tone of the series of webinar that we have initiated, and particularly the inception webinar, which we had on the 18th of September on fundamentals of hydrodiplomacy. We had a very engaging and intense discussion on particularly to understand what hydrodiplomacy is, what shapes hydrodiplomacy, why is hydrodiplomacy important in today's context, particularly focusing on South Asia. We had an eminent panelist. We started the discussion with a keynote address, which was delivered by Professor T.G. Sitharam, who is the director of IIT Guwahati and a professor of civil engineering in the Indian Institute of Technology, Guwahati. Professor Sitharam briefed us how in India we can move from a situation of water scarcity to water security. He emphasized on small reservoirs, like coastal reservoirs, which can be used as a mechanism to store water, and why it is a viable solution compared to large dams. He also pointed out how this can also be used as a point of dialogue between India and Bangladesh, as both countries have major coastlines, and water security is important for both the countries. Followed by the keynote address, where he set the tone of the need for hydrodiplomacy when we are talking about water. We went to the panel discussion, and during the panel discussion, some very important perspectives came up. One of the important things that came up, as you can see, that we had a very interdisciplinary panelists. We had ex-diplomats, we had academicians, we also had people representing from multiple bilateral and multilateral organizations. One of the points that came up is that, rivers usually by countries, when they sit together to negotiate about water, which is shared by two or more countries, rivers are often seen as property assets that different countries divide among themselves. However, in doing so, all stakeholders end up having less resources than they would have otherwise. And therefore, there is a very important need to go for an integrated river basin management. In the context of South Asia, it was also discussed that South Asia share a common ecological space. So any ecological degradation will have an impact on all the countries sharing the ecological space. Then coming and talking about hydrodiplomacy, it was also mentioned that it is very important to actually understand and think what are we negotiating for and for whom are we negotiating. And that is important because several times we see that the one who is on the negotiating table are probably not the direct stakeholders. So how can we make hydrodiplomacy inclusive? Politics and water was discussed extensively, as we all know that water and politics are intrinsically linked. And both the diplomats, one who comes from Bangladesh and another from India, agreed that diplomats are conditioned to embark on zero-sum game. They are basically taught to protect and preserve their sovereign right, which is across the country, across the world. And to improve this, it is very important to improve the quality of diplomacy itself. And to do that, academic institutions can play a very important role. This is where the emphasis came that academic institutions like ours should come up with courses where we can actually train young aspiring diplomats. We can teach them that water has multifaceted use and it is a very interdisciplinary subject. And also, how do you negotiate around water is something that needs to be taken up, particularly in the context of South Asia, as hydrodiplomacy is still at a very nascent stage. And the last but not the least, we also spoke about, there was a discussion on gender. It was felt that while water and gender has a link, but it is mostly seen when we talk about domestic water. But when you move to a transboundary scale, hydrodiplomacy is very much dominated by male. And that is also a reason why there seems to be a kind of hegemonic space, and that needs to be broken. And a lot of kind of women needs to come in, even when you talk about hydrodiplomacy or you talk about facilitator, mediators, and make it much more inclusive from every aspect, including the marginalized community. So briefly, this is what was discussed. Now, all of these things that were discussed are actually a topic on its own. And in the series of webinar that we are going to have, we have each of these topics will be discussed in detail, be it water and politics, gender and water, all of these things, law, everything would be coming up as one of the session. So today's session is going to focus mostly on water security and integrated modeling studies. We strongly feel that when countries negotiate or when countries come to talk about water, one of the main intention behind all the countries is basically how can we have water security, because water security also means food security, energy security. And so when you talk about hydrodiplomacy, one of the major aim behind this hydrodiplomacy is also to ensure that each and every country has enough water to ensure that lives and the livelihood of people is safe and everybody has secured food as well as energy, access to energy. So today I'm very pleased to introduce you to our speaker, who is Professor Roger A. Falconer, and I'm sure many of you already know him. He's an Emeritus Professor of Water Management and also founding Director of Hydro Environmental Research Center in the School of Engineering at Cardiff University. He has also worked in other universities such as Birmingham and Bradford. He has managed a wide range of research projects on hydro-environmental modeling and has also conducted several EIA studies worldwide. He has published extensively in the field of water management, advises governments and consulting companies in the UK and also internationally on water-related topics. He is a fellow of Royal Academy of Engineering, a foreign member of the Chinese Academy of Engineering, and a fellow of the Institution of Civil Engineers and the Chartered Institution of Water Environmental Management. In his talk today, what he's basically going to focus on is to look at the important issues and challenges related to water security, such as impact of climate change, population growth, water quality issues, water, energy, food nexus, virtual water, etc., which are all so diverse. But how can you arrive at a holistic approach to achieve water security in spite of these challenges? He will bring in experiences from across the world and also river and coastal basins. Thank you so much, Professor Falconer, for joining us from the UK today. The session will be chaired by Professor T.G. Sitharam. Again, many of you know him. He's the director of IIT, Indian Institute of Technology, Guwahati. He joined on July 1st, 2019. He's also a professor in the Department of Civil Engineering and also serving as a senior professor in Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. Presently, he is the Honorary Professorial Fellow at University of Wollongong in Australia, and also a Distinguished Professor at Hangzhou University International Innovation Center, China. In 2015, Professor Sitharam received the prestigious IGA Skukelman Award for his lifetime contribution in geotechnical engineering. He is the Chief Editor of International Journal of Geotechnical Earthquake Engineering in the USA. I will now hand this session over over to Professor Sitharam. This session, we would like to kind of have an hour from both the chair as well as from the speaker, and followed by question and answers from the participants. Just one announcement to the participants is that you will be able to type your questions on the chat box. You can start typing your questions for both the chair as well as for the speaker, and we will take the questions once the session is over. And each of these, and you can please specify to whom the question is for. With this, I'm going to hand it over to you, sir, to Professor P.G. Sitharam. Thank you.
Namaskar from India. Roger Falconer, Professor Anamika Barua. Thank you very much. Welcome to this special lecture by Professor Roger Falconer, an authority on water security. He is also the past president of the International Association of Hydro-Environmental Research, one of the oldest water-related organizations, IAHR. And also presently he is the vice president of International Association for Coastal Reservoir Research, IACRR, and he is helping us a lot in the organization of the next World Conference in China. Today, see, particularly the webinar series on hydrodiplomacy is a very interesting topic and is also very, very useful topic. Water is the lifeline of human civilization and is often referred to as commons. Basically, resources that are meant to be collective use belonging to all. That kind of a common sense should emanate not only just in the administrators, the policy makers, and also the common man. Even in a small village, they should understand that this is for share. So as Mahatma Gandhi ji said, there is enough resources for us to use, but not for really, you have to very scientifically use this. So this webinar series of hydrodiplomacy is one of the very important series for India itself. Why I say that? Because India is want to become a 5 trillion economy. If India wants to become 5 trillion economy, our people in villages, which has more than 6 lakh villages in India, should have water as a commodity or a resource to every home, and it should be available at their home. Even today in India, people carry water on head to their homes, taking almost 10 to 15 kilometers away. So today's talk by Professor Roger Falconer is going to introduce some of the general challenges of global water security and highlight the likely global impact of climate change, increasing population growth and pollution on water resources, including flooding, drought, as highlighted increasingly in the media. You have seen, water is there everywhere, but there is not even a drop of water in summer to drink. The nexus between water, food, energy, Professor Falconer is going to introduce to the audience, along with the concept of virtual water. This is really a fantastic idea. What Professor Roger Falconer, I actually picked it up and I keep referring him all this on the virtual water, because that's where I think we need to do a lot, so that we can, the need for society, industry, and government to address water security challenges in a global framework. He's also going to present examples on how Western originated cultures in countries such as UK can have a significant impact on the water security for citizens living in many less well-developed countries like India. The case that some small step changes in the behavior could have a giant impact on the water security in so many other countries, he's going to bring it out with how we could have a marked impact in improving the quality of life of so many fellow citizens worldwide, particularly in developing countries like in India. The concept of water security and the need for a holistic approach to water management will also be discussed by him at the local river and coastal basin level. He is also going to give a case study of the Ribble River basin and its impact on the bathing water quality along the Flight coast, which includes the seaside resort of the Blackpool. The results which he is going to present highlight the significance of catchment management, sediment transport, on the fecal indicator organism levels affecting the bathing water quality. Basically, this example has generic applications, and particularly where rivers flow down short and steep river basin catchments. This is very, very relevant for India, particularly the river Ganges example. So where not only it is fecal matter, it is also a lot of pollution from industries which are located adjacent to Ganges. We have the Ganges regeneration plan. Now Government of India in 2019 made it the Jal Shakti department, incorporating all of them together. So this has a lot of repercussion on, and I hope some of the officers of the Jal Shakti are also online. If not, I think I request Professor Anamika Barua to summarize some of these events, lectures, and send it to Jal Shakti department. With these few remarks, I am very, very happy to invite Professor Roger Falconer to start his lecture. I should not be in between him and you. Over to Professor Roger Falconer.
Professor Sitharam, Professor Baru, ladies and gentlemen, it is a real pleasure and honor to be speaking to you today on water security and integrated model studies. When I talk here about water security, I am talking about the security of fresh water and water resources and water supply, and security shouldn't be considered in any wider context. So I'm currently involved in working with Cardiff University and continuing work from the past. And I'm also involved with Hohai University in China and the Yangtze Institute. So first of all, I would like to raise the question and the point, why should we consider water on a global context rather than just within a country? And what impact perhaps might the UK have on water security in a country like India, for example? So I first got involved in this when we know that global water security is of growing concern globally. There have been many reports written recently, articles in newspapers, magazines, and so forth. And I got involved in about 2008 with the Royal Academy of Engineering in the UK when we wrote this report on global water security. It made me realize that there was more to water management than simply modeling flow, water quality, sediment transport process in rivers, estuaries, and coastal waters, which I'd been doing for the last 35 years of my academic career prior to that. So I spent more time in recent years working on looking at global water security. So if we look first at our water resource, we have very large volume of water, 1.4 billion cubic kilometers. However, only 35 million cubic kilometers of fresh water and only 1,000 in, sorry, just going to move this, 1,005 cubic kilometers is accessible. That, in the context of the Earth that you can see here, that is the equivalent to this dot. So actually, most of the water is, fresh water, of course, is trapped up in ice. So we actually have very little fresh water on the planet as it is now. We've had a lot of studies undertaken recently over the last 30 years in particular on climate change. The IPCC 2019 is keen to keep the temperature rise between 1 and at the most 2 degrees centigrade. But at the moment, we seem to be much more on target to end up at the end of this century around 3 degrees centigrade, according to recent reports from the WMO. So climate change is one challenge to start with. Another one is the perfect storm that was raised by Sir John Beddington in 2009, predicting that by 2030, the world's population will have increased from 6 billion to 8 billion. We're already over 7 billion and we're not at 2030 yet. And this will require a 50% increase in the demand for food to feed all the extra people that will be on the planet by 2030, a 30% increase in water and a 50% increase in energy demand. So where is this water going to come from for the future, and how secure is it? So when we look at global water security and some of the typical challenges, many of our rivers are currently polluted. The ancient Romans had better water quality than half of the people living on the planet today. The problem is in countries like the UK, there is a tendency to think this happens everywhere else. In countries like Africa, for example, and maybe India and many countries in the Asia-Pacific region, but not in the UK and Europe. The other big challenge is that 70% of the world's freshwater supply is devoted to agriculture. This is a huge proportion of the water that is available for consumption on the planet, and we need to make sure that we are efficient in agriculture production. Well, one of the very good examples is a river very close to where I live here. It goes through the small town of Ilkley. So it isn't just countries like India that have problems with polluted rivers. This is a pristine river 5 kilometers upstream from here, and this is the Bolton Abbey. And at this near this site, you can see that the cattle walk into the stream, leaving diffuse source pollution. We have stormwater overflows. Where I live here, we have high mountains at the back, one famous mountain called Ilkley Moor. We have very high flood discharges, and those discharges discharge sewer outflow through a sewer outflow, giving us point source pollution. And then just downstream, in the summer months, we have a lot of people bathing in this river, and they are exposed to pollution from diffuse sources and point sources in many cases. And when we look at this, the requirement for the basic water quality in terms of E. coli in a river in the UK is 900 coliform fecal units per 100 mil. And you can see here that we have values of 35,000 in the river in July and 39,000, 5 times the minimum standard for pollution in rivers. That's $1.2 billion people have no access to safe drinking water on the planet today, and 2 million mainly diarrhea. It's very rare for a child in my country to die of diarrhea. It doesn't seem to hit the headlines in a big way, particularly in comparison to COVID-19. Many developing countries in the world typically have to walk 5 kilometers daily to get water for the family. I find this pretty well unbelievable with all the technology we have today, that we can't provide resources for women in many parts of the world to collect water for the family without having to walk 5 kilometers each day. Flooding can cause many deaths globally, and the one that I remember most is the 2004 Aceh earthquake in Indonesia, where 240,000 people lost their lives as a result of flooding associated with the tsunami. The tsunami traveled at typically 500 miles an hour, 800 kilometers an hour, the same speed as a jumbo jet. It would have taken 3 hours to get from Aceh in Indonesia to Sri Lanka, for example. And with all the technology and sophisticated equipment we have today, we weren't able to send a message to those people in Sri Lanka. I'm just taking Sri Lanka as an example. To move to higher grounds, and that this tsunami was coming their way. And this hasn't changed much. It might have changed recently short term with COVID-19, but more than half the hospital beds in the world are filled by people with water-related diseases. So water security is a big global challenge. We then have the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and the aim is to accomplish these goals by 2030. Personally, I doubt whether they would have been accomplished by 2030, irrespective of the COVID-19. Some of these goals are extremely difficult to accomplish in many parts of the world. And hydroenvironmental research and engineering is relevant to every one of the goals in Sustainable Development Goal 6. And here are the key bullet points here. The 8 goals are access to safe and affordable drinking water, access to adequate sanitation and hygiene, improvements in water quality, increase in water use efficiency, implemented integrated water resources management, protect and restore water-related ecosystems, expand international cooperation, and strengthen local community participation. All of these we would fully applaud, and there are still many challenges to accomplish these goals, certainly on a global level. So I'd like to turn first to the water, food, energy nexus. We need water to provide energy, hydroelectric dams, for example, and we need energy to move water. So water and energy are interlinked. We need energy to provide food, and we need food, and the food gives us energy, for example. And likewise, we need water to provide food, and so on. The problem is if you change any one of these parameters, it affects the other two. And the problem is at the moment, I think, we are focusing an enormous amount of attention globally on the carbon footprint, but we are not really considering the impact of energy and food, for example, on the water footprint, and likewise for others. So let's look at some of the pressures on water resources. Climate change is leading to increasing water stress. The population is increasing and expected to increase by another 40% to 11 billion by 2100. And more citizens are moving from rural areas to the big megacities. So we have two changes here, population increase and population focusing much more on the coastal megacities. Food production is expected and needed to increase by 40% over the next 50 years. Industrial demand is going to require much more in terms of water resources. When I was a child, over 60 years ago, you were lucky to have a car, and if you had a car, you just had one car. Now in the UK, people have in a family typically at least two cars, and the water demand to produce a car is quite significant. We have more disposable income. We can see this in countries like India and China and so forth. More goods are purchased. There's a change in the diet. And that diet change in many countries in the world can lead to more meat consumption. And just to pick up this point on meat consumption, 1 kilogram of beef, for example, requires about 15,500 litres of water. In contrast, 1 kilogram of wheat only requires 1,300 litres of water. So increasing wealth usually means an increase in the demand for water. So I'd like to take you now, if I may, to the water cycle. We start off here with 100% water falling from the cloud, and I'd like to follow the blue path, which is the water going through the rivers, lakes, and so forth, and then ending up in the ocean. So we start off here with 100%, but only 36% ends up coming out of the river and going into the ocean. I'd like to follow this path in particular. So water is withdrawn along the way from the clouds right up in the upper reaches of the catchment or river basin, and it's taken off for consumptive use, for the home, for example. It's taken off to produce products, and so on. And those products, let's take this as a paper mill, for example, can be used for domestic consumption. So in other words, we're using water here flowing through India to produce paper for India, or that paper could be exported. And this paper, if it's exported, let's say to the UK, for example, then this is what we call virtual water. That water, this water from Estuary River here to produce this paper, which then goes off to the UK, this water is Indian water to produce a commodity for the UK. And likewise with food. So if we come down the green path here, we are producing food, let's say cotton, corn, for example, and that can be used and consumed internally, which is your own water, fine, so you have to manage that. But then also you could be exporting that overseas, and that's what we would classify as virtual water. So when we look at the water footprint of a nation, such as the UK, for example, we consider the water consumed and used to produce goods and services within that nation. And that consists of two components. There's the internal water footprint from inside the country. So if we rear cattle on our fields, for example, in the UK, they drink water from UK rivers. And then let's say those cattle provide meat in the UK and are consumed by the public for meat. That's internal water footprint. That's water from our own rivers that's used to produce that meat. If, however, we export that meat, or lamb, for example, to another country, then we're using water in the UK to the other countries. So the water footprint of a nation consists of the water used internally, that's our own water, plus the water we import from overseas, another country, minus the water we export internationally. Now the UK has one of the highest virtual water footprints of any country in the world. It's not the highest, but it's near the highest. And if you look at this graph of the UK, the internal water footprint for the UK on an annual basis is 38.6 gigacubic meters. The external water footprint, that's what we import from other countries, or virtual water from other countries, is almost twice as much. And that's mainly agriculture, so food, for example, cotton, and industry, water used for the production of cars, for example, in other countries. So let's look at this virtual water footprint in a little more detail. And this is information from the University of Twente, where the late Ariane Hoekstra led a very large and highly respected internationally the water footprint network. If I drink 1 cup of coffee here and go out now in a local coffee shop and buy a cup of coffee, I will have effectively consumed 140 litres of water in producing that medium-sized cup of coffee. Now, we don't produce any coffee ourselves in the UK, so this is all virtual water. So every time I drink a cup of coffee, if it comes from Kenya or Brazil, for example, I have effectively consumed 140 litres of water. If I eat a steak, I have consumed typically 3,750 litres of water, 26 bars to produce that steak. And that food is probably coming from within the UK. And then I want to turn to cotton and jeans, for example. So if I buy a pair of cotton jeans, denim jeans in this case, or a dress or whatever, you're typically talking around 70 plus bars of water, 10,850 litres. And I want to use cotton as my example, if I may, because we produce no cotton in the UK. We don't have the right climate. So we'll look at the impact of cotton consumption on the blue water footprint, i.e. the water footprint of the water flowing in a river. And where does most of this come from? Well, most of it now into the European, this is, by the way, the European Union. Most of the cotton that's coming into the European Union comes from Uzbekistan. But an awful lot, 2,500 million cubic meters per year, comes from India. And this is the impact that we have had in Kazakhstan. So the virtual water, the commodity consumption within the European Union has had a huge impact on water security in Kazakhstan. The Aral Sea has pretty well disappeared because the Aral Sea provided water through irrigation to provide cotton for the West. And you can see the consequences here. There's now very little water left in Kazakhstan, so we've now shifted to Uzbekistan. And you can see that even fishing is not possible any longer because the lake virtually does not exist. We also need to educate the public. The man on the left here is a British newsreader. He could wear that same suit pretty well every day of the week. He might have 2 or 3 suits, for example. He might have a different white shirt every day, but he could wear the same white shirt every day. He could turn up to read that news dressed like that every day of the week. Barack Obama always had a white shirt on, a grey suit and a mauve tie. I don't think I ever saw Barack Obama in anything else on official business. However, if the woman on the right, let's say that's a cotton dress requiring 75 bars of water to produce, and let's assume it comes from India, the cotton. She would be expected to wear a different dress every day of the week in terms of reading the news. So the water footprint of a woman in the UK, not only the UK, the whole of Europe and Western culture and so forth, is significantly higher than that of a man in general because of the demand of cotton for the clothes and so on. And that pretty well always comes from another country. So we have to ask some questions here. How efficiently are we helping those other countries to make sure that that water is of high quality when dress is produced? There's no problem with changing the dress every day, and there's no problem with getting cotton from India, provided the water that's put back into the river is as clean as it is when it comes in to irrigate the land and produce the cotton in the first place. And this is part of the problem in so many parts of the world. We in the West, for example, buy commodities here without realizing the impact we're having on the water pollution in many of those countries, because the farmers and so forth are not under pressure to treat the water before it goes back into the river. So in the same way that we had free trade coffee introduced in this country many years ago, the price of coffee went up quite significantly. And people became very keen to buy fair trade coffee, where the people making the coffee were paid a fair wage. I, like many other people, would prefer to pay much more for the shirt I've got on now. This shirt would have cost me perhaps £20 in the UK. And it hasn't changed much in price over many years. I would be quite happy to pay more for this shirt if I knew that the extra I was paying was being put into treating this water before it goes back into the river and polluting the river of another country. And then I could say, legitimately, I was buying clothes which had no adverse impact on the water security of another country. We accept that we cannot produce cotton in the UK. We need to turn to countries like India to supply us with cotton, but we really should make sure that the quality of the water going back after the cotton is produced for people, for the benefit of people like myself, that cotton is, the water is as clean as it was when it was first taken into the fields. So who pays for the ecosystem services downstream? And the problem is here, there's not a lot of attention paid in many parts of the world, including my own, to the impact of water, virtual water, and the adverse impact of virtual water on the water security of many other countries is not included in the cost of things like clothes here in the UK. Excuse me. So let's look at some of the solutions for global water security and the challenges we face globally. One that's often suggested is desalination, but desalination is still very expensive. It usually requires a very large carbon footprint. And in many enclosed basins, such as the Persian Gulf or the Arabian Gulf, depending whether you lived on the west or the east side of the basin, has a very narrow entrance through the Straits of Hormuz. And the long-term hydroecological impacts of desalination must be quite substantial because you are increasing the salinity levels quite significantly. We then have conservation of water and reuse. This is a very important topic in my country, which comes up all the time. Don't fill the bath so full and so forth, but that's just internal consumptive use. That does not really affect the people in another country, such as India. So there's a lot of focus on conservation and water reuse, and that's what you pay your bills for. I pay my water bills here for consumptive use of water, but that's an internal issue. That does not affect other countries, so we don't need to consider that globally. And then we need to look at another point, storage, water transfer and integrated water resources management. So often we have not looked at the river basin holistically from the very top, the cloud to the coast. And I'll come back to that with my example later because that draws out some interesting points. We need to improve the water quality in the catchments and river basin because so often we focus on flooding and we don't take account of the fact that many more people often die from the after effects of the flood, diffuse source pollution, for example, vis-a-vis the effect of flooding itself. So we need to concentrate just as much on pollution in terms of water security as focusing the media's attention on flooding. The media is often keen to report floods in any part of the world, but they often don't report afterward. After the flood has receded, they don't then report on the impact of disease and so forth in the polluted waters left after the flood. And another possible solution is to go back to the whole system as a whole and look to coastal reservoirs. And these are increasingly being planned for water security of many coastal megacities around the world. Shanghai is one very good example, where about 50% of the water now comes from a very large reservoir in the Yangtze estuary. So some of these examples are vertical farming. I know in the US they're looking at this quite seriously, and I think it's something we should look to much more worldwide. Get far more crop per drop. Only 1% of the water is needed for food growth when you compare it to traditional farming. And some of the latest farms are like hospital operating theatres where people go in with clothes, masks and so forth, so that the food is of very high quality. There is no nitrates and phosphates used, for example. There's no pollution of the water. There are no insects getting into the room and into the farm and so forth. So this is something I think we should look to the future. Then we come to the cloud to coast approach. So historically, what happens is the particle of rain falls from the cloud and it then goes through the system to the coast. But on the way, this particle falls from the cloud. It falls on the land where the animal might have left waste. This waste then gets picked up by this water package. Let's consider it as a water package. It then travels down the stream, from the stream to the brook, from the brook to the river, and then all the way through the system down to the estuary. Now, historically, we've got various models and various groups in companies. We have the catchment system, we have the groundwater modelers, we have the sewer modelers, we have the hydrodynamic modelers for the 1D system, the 2D estuary, the 3D ocean models. These groups of people often don't talk too much to one another, and even within large companies, they can be separate groups. But when this particle falls here from the cloud, it doesn't know whether it's in the catchment, it doesn't know whether it's in the 1D, and it doesn't know when it's in the 2D system. So these models need to include hydrodynamics, water quality, which they commonly do, but one thing they often don't include is sediment transport, and I want to come back to that later. So we need a holistic approach to make sure that we design the most effective and water secure buildings within a city centre, within a large megacity, for industry, for the domestic purposes here, for example. We then treat the water in the treatment works here, and then we discharge it through a long sea outfall here. That's typically the past. This is historically what we have done with many of our megacities. We take water in from the river well upstream. We have low flow, much lower flows here very often. The water goes around the system and then it goes out to the sea through a long sea outfall. This can lead to serious ecological impacts in the river water system, from the clean water upstream, which doesn't require a lot of treatment, to the water coming through the river much closer to the city and then in the estuary. So one solution to this is to take the water out from upstream in the clean water area, send it around the city, and then pump it back out so that we discharge it just slightly downstream of the wastewater treatment works. Of course, this can be quite expensive for many large cities, but it is an ideal solution from the ecological management perspective. Another possibility is to capture the water at the end of the river basin, instead of building large dams right at the head, and collect the water at the end of the river basin system and operate the system so that we only take water in under high flood conditions, and we take in much larger volumes of fresh water into the basin so that the reservoir remains basically primarily fresh water. And then we require minimum treatment for the city which is located, the large megacity which is located nearby. So this is an example of what has happened in the Yangtze, for example. And Professor Sitharam and myself are leading an international association focusing attention now on coastal reservoirs. So I'd just like to make a couple of points here before we move on to my example. If I look at things like the Formula One car, for example, and there is a Formula One race on today, or practice today, and this weekend, huge amounts of resources have been put into things such as Formula One cars. Hundreds of millions are spent every year. Huge developments have then occurred over my lifetime on the motor car. The last time I bought a car for my wife, for example, it had a certain petrol consumption. When we then replaced it with another Volkswagen Golf, the petrol consumption was dramatically improved. So we see that when we put huge amounts of funding into the motor car, we make dramatic developments. The same with the aeroplane and so forth. However, nothing like the same amount of investment has gone into agriculture and water supply and the distribution of water to produce more crop per drop. And 70% of the world's fresh water is currently used for agriculture. So if we spent one small fraction of the amount of money spent on car development, we would have much better quality water globally. And also, I believe this is something which is much more attractive to get women into engineering rather than encourage them to work on things like Formula One cars and so on. So I believe there are great opportunities to improve water security globally for the future. Now I'd like to talk about a regional water security example, and I want to show you why I believe we have to have a systems solution for a river basin. too often in the past, when we dealt with a flooding problem in the UK, we have just modelled the river flow around the region, the city. It may not be near the coast, it may be further upstream, maybe halfway along the river basin, for example. And we have produced the right defence, flood defence for that city. However, when we then look to the future and the next flood comes along, we may not flood that city, but we've only moved the problem further downstream. This has happened to many of the towns not far from here. It's a town in York, for example, and now Leeds. And what I believe we have to do more of in the future is model the whole river system if we're looking at flooding, and make sure that when we make changes to one part of the river, it doesn't adversely affect the flood risk of some other community. Excuse me. But in this example, I'm going to concentrate on hydroepidemiological studies, and particularly fecal indicator organisms. So this study relates to this area in the UK. It's the northwest of England. And there is a major, fairly substantial river by UK standards coming here and discharging into the coast. This is called the River Ribble. It discharges into the coast. This is what we call a compliance point, where we have to meet the European Union Bathing Water Directive at this point. And this is one of our most popular seaside resorts called Blackpool. And Blackpool was failing to comply with the EU Bathing Water Directive in the late 80s, early 90s, and that was a major concern. So investment had to be undertaken to address the water pollution along this beach. Here you can see how densely populated this beach would have been in 1965. And here you can see in 2018, for example, how populated this beach is for the summer months, and there will be many children swimming in the water here. So they're very vulnerable to any pollution, fecal indicator pollution in this bathing water. So in the early 1990s, the water company invested considerably in trying to improve the water quality along this bathing water, because it was claimed that the bulk of the problem was as a result of contamination from these sites along here. So $800 million was invested between 1983 and 1996. 3 new wastewater treatment works were built. 5 large pump-in stations were built, but it still failed to comply with the Bathing Water Directive. So the studies in the first place, which I was involved with, were failure to meet the 1976 EU Bathing Water Directive. It was thought that the main problems were the combined sewer overflows discharging along the coast and river. Extensive field surveys were undertaken to show that we were not complying with there was non-compliance with the EU Bathing Water Directive. And detailed hydroepidemiological modelling studies were undertaken in the tidal part of the river and estuary. And one of the objectives was to quantify the impacts of the stormwater overflows and investigate the influence of tides, rivers, and so on. We had very good agreement on the hydrodynamic front in the modelling. I won't dwell on this part of the study, but this is not something that's ideal for an academic, because if you have very good agreement in your studies, then it's very difficult to get further funding for further research. And when we came to model the fecal coliform levels in the river, we found this was in the estuary. Milepost is the name of the site. We found under dry weather flow conditions, we were measuring values of typically 1,000 counts per 100 mil, and we were generally predicting that through the tidal cycle. When we had wet river flows, the parameters were much higher. The fecal indicator levels were much higher, up at nearly 40,000. And you can see here that, again, we were getting reasonably good agreement. And here you can see the consequences of that. This is the compliance point. Green and yellow in particular is failure to comply with the Bathing Water Directive. So when we had dry weather flows in the River Ribble and the estuary here, we were not failing to comply with the Bathing Water Directive. We were failing to meet the Bathing Water Directive at the compliance point here, however, under wet weather flow conditions, which suggested that the problem was coming from the river rather than the coast along here. where much of the investment had been spent before this study was undertaken. However, this study still had a lot of shortcomings in terms of modeling the whole system. We calibrated the 1D and the 2D model separately. We had different kinetic decay rates for both. We had different values for the dispersion diffusion coefficients. We had a different flow area at the section where we went from the 1D to the 2D model. We even used different bed representations in the 1D and the 2D model. We had a simplified treatment of the decay and source inputs. We took average values, and yet these values are very episodic. So if you measure fecal levels coming out of or off the land, for example, they can vary dramatically within a few split seconds. And we did 3D modeling of the hydroepidemiology in the coastal zone. In 2011, we were repeating this study in some detail, but involving many universities, many companies, and so forth. A new EU Water Framework Directive was introduced in 2006, which was to be applied from 2015 onwards, which had much stricter bathing water standards. So we knew that this beach was no longer going to comply with bathing water standards after 2015. There was concern about the impact of recent land use changes upstream. We have been trying to become more self-sufficient in food, a big increase in food consumption from the land upstream, and what impact would this have on the bathing water quality? So we needed to develop an integrated catchment to coast model from the urban and rural inputs right up the upper end of the catchment, right down to the coast. Before, we'd only gone up to the tidal limit, which was about 10 kilometers from the estuary, mouth of the estuary. We collected extensive data on E. coli loads and fluxes, much more than has ever been collected previously in any UK river basin. And we modeled the whole hydroecological system for E. coli, which is the new parameter for the bathing water standard. And we looked at gastroenteritis disease levels in the bathing waters. So this was our basin. This is the river Ribble, and the catchment goes right up here. So it's this whole area here, and this is the coastal zone. We used our 3D model to predict the hydrodynamics in the outer sea, in the Irish Sea. We then used that to drive the boundary conditions and the flow in the coastal zone using a 2D and 3D model. We used the Stanford watershed model to model the catchments, and we used a model called InfoWorks provided by HR Wallingford to look at the sewers in the urban city environments. We modeled and included 28 catchments, and these varied dramatically. Some were pretty flat with a horizontal terrain, others were very steep, and some had mild terrain slopes. They vary from forestry dominated catchments to agricultural catchments, arable land, and pasture land. And some of these were rural and some were urban. So Preston, for example, the catchments here were very much urban city. So in the arable catchments where the animals are reared, you can see the waste from the animals and the farmer spreading the waste from the cattle, from the milking cows once a week. And also the cattle are walking into the streams. We are now putting pressure on the local authorities to put pressure on the farmers to fence off the streams. And the farms themselves have septic tanks where the waste goes, and there's a lot of leakage into the groundwater. Extensive measurements were taken in the rivers and the coastal zone, measuring the hydrodynamics, the water quality, plume dispersion, both day and night. And here we can see some measurements of the E. coli and enterococci. And we can see in fresh water at night, it's almost conservative. In estuarine waters in the day, it's down at the T90 value is 30 and 33. So it's almost an order of magnitude, decaying much more rapidly in saline water. For enterococci, the decay rate doesn't vary anywhere near so much as it does for E. coli, between day and night, for example. We modeled 1,031 cross sections in the river system. We found we had pretty good agreement with water levels by and large, and we had pretty good agreement with measured data for the discharges. We then came further downstream to the estuarine basin, and we modeled suspended sediments, the E. coli levels, but we included the link between suspended sediments and E. coli through adsorption and desorption of E. coli from the sediments. And here we can see pretty good prediction of the suspended sediment levels. Excuse me. We then went into the coastal zone, and again, we had pretty good agreements with the hydrodynamics. And then we went back and looked at the data in more detail in the upper reaches of the river, and we find some interesting points. When we measure the water column, we find that green is the fecal E. coli level on the bed. Here we can see we have the highest levels in July in the bathing water season. The green here giving us the highest values up at, this is 0.8 times 10 to the 16 CFU on the bed. So we know that the bed sediments have very, very high levels of E. coli attached to the sediment particles, and they're in fairly deep water, so they're not decaying. We find that the blue is the fresh water in the river itself, and you can see this is lower than bed sediments. So in other words, E. coli is being released from the bed sediments into the suspended sediments. And then we find the suspended sediments in the water column under storm conditions still have high levels of E. coli. They've come from the bed and they've released some of that E. coli into the water column. In other words, when we model the whole system from the top of the catchment right down to the coast, we find that it isn't just the water that transports E. coli from the upper reaches of the catchment down to the coast, but also suspended sediment is an important mechanism for transporting E. coli. And it absorbs E. coli when it comes down with the first flood, but may release it on the second flood. So we find that the bed and suspended sediments with adsorption and desorption is another important pathway for E. coli transport. So when we modeled it the first time round, we found we were often under-predicting conditions in the coastal zone, and now we have a better understanding why, because we were not including suspended sediment transport as an important mechanism of E. coli transport in that first study. So if I come to conclusions, water security is of increasing concern, particularly with climate change. We also need global solutions. We need to educate people in my country that if we are buying clothes from India or Uzbekistan or any country, we should expect to pay more and make sure that the water is treated before it is put back into the system so that we are not adversely affecting water quality in another country. So therefore, water footprint and virtual water is a very important point to get across to the public and politicians, industry, and the public in particular in countries like mine. People in this country are very focused now on reducing the consumptive water consumption, but that really only addresses our use of our water in our own country. It does not have any impact on our adverse effect on water quality in a country such as, let's say, India. And water security within the country needs to have an IWRM systems approach to solve the problems, both globally and regionally. So when we look at water security, we need to look at the whole system, the whole planet. If we are getting coffee from Brazil, for example, we need to make sure we're paying enough for that coffee to ensure that we don't adversely affect the water there, water quality there. And hydroepidemiological studies show that E. coli levels depend on the hydraulics, biochemistry, and the source inputs. So it isn't good enough anymore when we're looking at water quality just to employ civil engineers with a hydraulics background. We need to work as a multidisciplinary team. We need to have biochemists in the team. We need to have monitoring expertise in the team. We need a whole multidisciplinary team to look at addressing water security. And then from the study I showed you, when we look at the predictions at a catchment-wide scale, from the top of the catchment right down to the coast, we can see that sediment transport, not usually included in water quality modeling, is a very important parameter. And if you'll bear with me, I'd just like to show you, oh, I think I forgot to press. I'll come back if I may and share my screen again. I want to show you a video which means a lot to me, and I hope that you will find it equally valuable because I think it sums up everything.
Sustainable Development Goal 6.
Ensure availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for
By 2030, achieve
Assurer l'accès de
implementar la gestión integrada.
What is the goal if not a promise? And what is our promise worth if we do not keep it? Water, our most precious resource. Only 0.5% of the Earth's water is readily available for human consumption. Yet we live in a world of unquenchable thirst, where every nation must drink from the same well. Today, 40% of the world's people are affected by water scarcity. Climate change, one of the greatest challenges of our time, is accelerating catastrophic water events at an unprecedented rate. Shocks of drought and deluge unleash their devastation. While population growth increases demand for water, food, and energy, rivers dry up and no longer reach the sea. Today, our promise is at risk. We, as the heads of state and government of the high-level panel on water, have 3 calls to action. Turn it off, turn it on, turn it off. The first, turn off our denial of a global water crisis. Turn off that faucet and turn off the waste. Turn off pollution and destruction of our watersheds. Turn off the bacteria that harm our children. Turn off the path to fetching water. Turn to a path to education. Next, we need to turn it on. Turn on solutions. Turn on ideas. Turn on innovation. Turn on investments in infrastructure, sanitation, ecosystems management, and resilience. Turn on our political will to make the hard decisions about how we understand, value, and manage water. Turn up the urgency. Turn up the volume on the water dialogue. Turn up the intensity to keep our water promises. Turn up the heat on those who misuse water. Turn up the funding to finance universal access to water. Turn up the value we place on water. This is our defining moment. Water has forced itself to center stage. The UN Water Action Decade has begun. The world urgently needs us to keep our promise. We must all take action. Do you value water?
Thank you. Okay.
Professor,
I can't.
yeah, we can't. You have to unmute. Okay.
Professor Sitharam is still muted.
Yeah.
No, it was actually locked by them. Thank you. So I think all of you will agree now the talk is really has a greater impact and also a lot of ideas, Professor Falconer has given us today. And I think now we can directly go to some discussions or some questions. And if there is any questions, even to me, I will be ready to address. So thank you, Roger. It is a fantastic lecture. Really enjoyed the video also, what you showed us. and it was very relevant, and that's the reality actually, and we need to do something collectively. And I think this webinar has raised the heat at the right time. It has raised the right questions. I think we need to now look for some collaboration to make these things happen. So these few remarks, over to Anamika to ask some questions.
Thank you, Professor Falconer and also Professor Sitharam. It was really a very, very interesting presentation. I have to confess that, like to hear such a presentation from a person who is coming from a very technical background, and then it is so easy for us to understand, itself makes it so important for us to, that shows that, how interdisciplinary this subject is. And this is one presentation, I understood everything from the very beginning till the end. So thank you very much. And
thank you.
We haven't really received question, but there is a lot of reaction to your presentation. One of the reaction is that this is a very, very exciting presentation. Thank you very much to they have also told us, and they have also mentioned that your presentation was highly, and it has enlightened them, and it was a wonderful presentation. There is one question, and that question is how to conduct virtual water trade under this COVID situation. Will it escalate the water security issue? The COVID situation, is it going to escalate the water security concern? That is one question just has come from one of the participants.
Well, the COVID situation is terrible across the world, and I wouldn't want to take anything away from that. But actually, it may have made us think a little bit about the future. And I think people in this, I think now is the time to promote the virtual water issue. We are global. We can see how this started in another country. It doesn't matter. In this case, it happened to be China, but I don't think it matters where it started. That is a separate issue. And we can see how the whole world has been affected by this particular virus. And it could have started anywhere, for that matter. And in the same way, we have when we buy commodities in the UK, for example, we have an effect on water quality, or could have an effect on water quality in countries like India, for example. And I think that COVID-19 will mean that people in this country will think again about the values that we have placed so much emphasis on in the past. And I think that people will think much more about where they buy the clothes from, where they buy the cotton from, where they buy the coffee from, and so forth, and the impact on those countries. So I think in the same way that with fair trade, now is the time to encourage people to spend more on commodities to ensure that if cotton is grown in Egypt, or I use cotton because we don't produce any cotton in this country, then we will make sure that extra money is put into the commodities to treat the water before it goes back into rivers, for example. And I think that it is a time to try to attract more women into engineering or science, because I think in the way we're going about it in many countries in the world, and by many people with many people at the moment, is to encourage more women to get involved in designing the Formula 1 car, for example. If I go to the local shop here now, I can buy for my grandchildren Brio trains, and I can buy blue for the boys and pink for the girls. Well, I think if the boys have always wanted to play with trains and the girls have wanted to play with dolls, and I don't see the point in trying to change that. But when we tell people about the pollution of water and the lack of investment in state-of-the-art irrigation, for example, and how women as well as men could save so many more lives in the world today than any medic can in his or her lifetime, through using technology, I think we are far more likely to get many more women into engineering, focusing on water quality, for example, improving the quality of life for fellow citizens, than trying to persuade them to improve next year's Formula 1 car for Lewis Hamilton or whoever. So I believe there are many challenges for the future which we can address. And I think in many ways, sadly, but I think COVID will bring us to the table to address these problems globally.
One more question, and that is, what are the main water resources, softwares or models exist to deal with transboundary watersheds?
Well, a lot of models available that in terms of water resources. The major laboratories provide those, or the old laboratories, the Danish Hydraulic Institute, now DHI, Deltaris, which was previously Delft Hydraulics. These were all originally government laboratories, and in the UK we have the Hydraulics Research Station, which is now HR Wallingford. These have all been privatized. We have the US EPA and so forth. They are using quite a lot of their models. I'm not I think that there are many universities offering models, using models, but you have to make sure that you are using the right models, because I've seen misuse of models in many parts of the world, where the model is acquired free of charge and so forth, and no engagement from those parties. For example, I'll just give you one example. If you go to a short, steep catchment, sorry to get a little bit technical, but just to make the point, because the person who's asked that question is obviously raising it with a technical background. If you model flow in a delta plane where you've got fairly low velocities and the flow travels over fairly slowly, and you're looking to design for floods or water quality, there are many, many models you can use. When I was teaching fluid mechanics at Cardiff University to undergraduate students, I would teach them all about how they could design flood models, and they could do flood modeling for that sort of problem. When you come to very steep catchments where the water is flowing down very rapidly, this is a much, much more complex problem. Many of the computer models that are available on free on the market today do not solve those problems properly. The level of sophistication is much more than a normal undergraduate course. So if you put it into a medical context, if you have medical general practitioner problem, then the undergraduate student can cover that. If you're looking at brain surgery and dealing with neurosurgery, that's not something that's covered in considerable detail on an undergraduate course. So modeling steep catchments is similar to the neurosurgeon doing state-of-the-art brain surgery vis-a-vis the ordinary general practitioner in medicine who deals with everyday problems. So sometimes, however, in comparing it to the medical context, we are getting the person who's got a very broad general education in medicine to try and do neurosurgery. And usually that probably ends in death of the patient. So we have that problem here. We need to understand what model is being used, because sometimes I've seen models inappropriately used. In fact, I refereed a paper this morning where I didn't recommend it be accepted because it was misuse of a very widely used model, a UK model as it happens.
Thank you. Another question is, would agroforestry system reduce water scarcity? Well, again, it's a bit of a complex question, because the argument in the UK often is that planting hundreds, if not millions of trees will stop a lot of the flooding problems, but it very much depends on the terrain. If you have plant a lot of trees, they're going to take a lot of the water out of the soil and then through evapotranspiration release that water. So from the carbon footprint point of view, it's probably a good thing, but in terms of water security, you were taking more water out for when you could have used that water for crops, for example, such as cotton or food. There is one last question.
It's difficult to, oh, sorry, on that point, it's difficult to give a specific answer. Generically, it's from the, and this is one of my points about you cannot look at the carbon footprint in isolation, because from a carbon footprint point of view and climate change, you would say that the more trees we plant, the better. But when you look at flooding and water security, sometimes you can be making things worse by planting lots of trees. I'm not saying that's always the case. Again, it requires a holistic solution for the particular catchment. So what might be relevant in the UK for a particular catchment, like the one behind in the picture on my page here, might not be relevant in India, for example.
The question is, do you agree that the problem of virtual water flow is because water is not considered as a factor of production in the production process?
Yes, I totally agree with that. And if it was, then the cost of commodities would go up considerably. For example, this shirt cost £20 today. It probably cost £20 or not much less 15 years ago. Most things in my country have gone up considerably over the last 15 years, but cotton has not. And why has it not gone up? Because we have gone to cheaper and cheaper countries in terms of labour costs. It's not the best of examples, but labour costs are the only parameters that are considered. I used to buy cotton clothes, for example, here it was marked Egyptian cotton. Now it's Chinese cotton or whatever. So it goes from country to country. And the cost of treating the water before it goes back in the river is not included in the virtual water costs. That was exactly the point in one of the key points in my lecture. And I think if people in the richer countries like the UK, for example, are told that, and if people are, and if it's marked on the product that the Indian government, for example, or whichever government guarantees that the cotton provided in this particular clothing, like the fair trade we had for coffee, people will be prepared to pay more. People paid a lot more in my country for coffee about 20 years ago when they were allowed to say that the coffee was fair trade. A cup of Americano at today's prices would have gone from £1.50 to £2.50, literally overnight, with a fair trade. And people were very happy to pay more for fair trade coffee because they felt that the people who were collecting the beans and so forth were paid a fair wage. And I think we should adopt the same with water. So if I would be quite happy, if there were two shirts in a shop, two identical shirts, one at £20 and one at £30, sorry for using British currency, it doesn't matter. And I knew that the second one, the water was treated to the same standard as the income, as the input, when it went back into the river, I would rather pay the extra money. I would have a clearer conscience. And that price is not included at the moment.
Yeah. So now there is a question which is related to geotechnology. How does geotechnology and subsurface hydrology come into play? Where are the avenues to take a leap in research and practical implementation?
Oh, Prof. Sitharam's the expert in this area.
Yeah, I'll tell you thank you.
Sorry.
The geotechnology, actually, that's where I think, we need a lot of innovations have to happen. See, Japanese have done most of their storage is below the ground, very close to the coast, because they have a very small land piece. So they don't have large dams. So all of their water storage, majority of more than 150 dams are underground water. That means very close to the coast, so they build what is called a diaphragm walls, and large amount of fresh water is stored inland, and there is no mixing of the salt water into this water body which is stored. So, and also see, as it is hidden, so there is a very less chances of getting polluted also, because many people do not know. When you see the open surface water only, they start all kinds of pollution will happen. The third part is, this water, what is underground, it is also it doesn't evaporate. So the evaporation losses will be less. So there are a lot of advantages. We need to innovate. We need to actually borrow practices of, even in India, in ancient India, there are a lot of water storage structures in Rajasthan and other, they're all underground. And even today in Kerala, they have water tunnels in the hills to collect water. So there will be a filtered fresh water coming out. So you do not require maybe any treatment as well. So there are a lot of innovations which we have either over a time forgotten in the knowledge system. So we need to really go back. It may be some of them in a smaller size, some of them in a medium size, some of them in a large scale also we need to look at it, like the coastal reservoirs or the large dams and surface water storages. But there are many avenues, and I think this topic is open for exploration. the research and practical implementation, the geotechnology of catching subsurface water, particularly the flood water, actually is a very good topic needs to look at. And luckily, you know, with the new materials also in geotechnology, like geosynthetics, we can do many things much more efficiently and much more very cost effectively also. Thank you.
Can I just go back and pick up one of the points? Thanks very much, Prof. Sitharam. Can I just make another point, because I think the question, I might have not intentionally ducked the question. And the point was raised about hydrology and groundwater, subsurface water. What has happened in many countries in the world, including my own, where you had an a rural environment, and then you build a city or a large town. Historically, we have concreted over the surface. We have then put drains in and taken the water quickly to the wastewater treatment works or to a stormwater overflow. And whereas we had impermeable ground before, and the water seeped through the ground into the groundwater and took quite a long time to get back into the river, now it gets back to the river very much quicker. And I'm not saying that that's the only reason why we've got flooding. We've got more flooding, of course, because of climate change and more intensive storm. But the other one is that we have concreted over large parts of the UK for development of cities and so forth. And with an expanding population, we need to learn from our mistakes in the past, and we need to make sure that the water that falls on the roofs of buildings goes into the groundwater and doesn't go back into the river straight away through a drainage system, so that we hold the water back in the catchment, in the groundwater. And that's done through schemes widely termed sustainable urban drainage systems. So this can be local reservoirs, it can be underground drains going straight into the under the ground rather than to the river. It is a problem.
Yeah. There is a question which is related to cotton production that you had mentioned in your presentation, that no cotton is produced in the UK. So the question is it because there is a government ban on cotton production? And what about other European countries? Do they produce cotton?
No, the hydrology isn't ideal in this country. So we don't have the right hydrology. So we have to turn to other countries that can produce cotton. And that's one of the reasons why I choose cotton. Coffee is the same. I'm sure that if we could produce coffee in this country, we are now starting to produce our own wine. But historically, we have not had wine from this country either, for example. And the amount of wine produced here is very small. So what most of the land is used here for wheat, cattle and sheep are reared on the land, and that's part of the food chain, of course, rightly or wrongly. And we don't grow cotton. So cotton is a powerful case in the UK, and also cotton requires a large amount of water. Okay. Rice is a good example, but not a huge amount of rice is eaten in the UK. So cotton is the best example, I find. If I'm talking to a lay audience, Rotarians, for example, who have no scientific background in general, then cotton is a very good example, because they know that everything comes from either Egypt, India, Uzbekistan, or those. Well, they may not know exactly which country, but they know it comes from those parts of the world, and they know it doesn't come from the UK. So I used cotton. I could have used many other examples.
Thank you very much. There are a few more questions, but okay, because of the time constraint, I will not be able to take all of it. So I will. What I can do is, some of these questions probably I can just share it with you, Professor. Hope that is okay with you. Some of the important questions that has come. Basically, these questions are reaction to some of the answers that you have given. So I'm going to share it with you. So I will have to now close this webinar. But thank you very much, Professor Falconer, and also Professor Sitharam, for this very enlightening presentation, and also making everybody aware of why water itself is a very global issue. I will end this webinar with something that your video spoke about, and that is turn up the volume of dialogue. And I think this is what we are doing through this series of hydrodiplomacy.
Yes.
So thank you very much, and we hope to have you once again in one of these webinar series. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye. Bye.
Thank
All
you.
right.
See
Thank
you
you.
soon.
Pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Okay. Bye.